It's a real pleasure for me to be here at this event celebrating the 10th anniversary. So I'm from Canada, and I have to tell you that issues of animal welfare things are not very encouraging in Canada. The animal advocacy movement has been more or less entirely unsuccessful in improving the legal status of animals in Canada, and in fact, far from getting better, in many ways, the situation of animals is getting worse in Canada. Every day, there's more and more animals being intensively factory farmed, and every day there's more and more animals being used in animal experimentation. And on the other hand, we have fewer and fewer animals left in the wild because of the way we continue to colonize and develop animal habitat. And so it's quite a depressing situation in Canada, and sometimes discouraging. So for us, it's really important to see successful examples like the Partij for the Animals here in the Netherlands to show that there is some hope for doing something effective for animals. And I know it's not just in Canada, that in many other countries, the Dutch Partij for the Animals has been a real inspiration. So it really is an honor for me to be sharing this 10th anniversary with you. So I'm a philosopher, and I'm worried about this political stagnation that we face in Canada, but I'm also worried about a slightly different issue, which is what I view as a kind of intellectual stagnation around the way in which we theorize animal rights. So if you think about the origins of the contemporary animal rights movement 40 years ago, philosophers like Peter Singer and Tom Regan were really important for the starting of this contemporary animal rights movement. That the arguments they made, the concepts they used, really helped to inspire people and to shape the discourse of the contemporary animal welfare movement. But that's 40 years ago, and I don't think that philosophers have really contributed that much since then. Of course, there's still many philosophers who work in the topic, but a fair number of them, in my view, are basically just engaged in pretty minor refinements of the arguments that Singer and Regan made 40 years ago. And these relatively minor refinements, they're interesting from an academic point of view, but they're not necessarily very significant for real-world advocacy. And I think it's time to, I'd like to think that philosophy still has something to contribute. This wouldn't really be a problem if the arguments that Singer and Regan gave 40 years ago answered all of the important questions about animal rights. And some people think that basically the arguments developed 40 years ago give us pretty much an adequate account of animal ethics, and that all that's left now is to go out and persuade people to agree to these arguments and to mobilize and to implement them. And actually, that's what I thought. I've been a supporter of animal rights for 25 years and a vegan, but I didn't write on this topic because I thought the arguments that Singer and Regan made 40 years ago, they'd said it all. So what's left to say? But I've increasingly come to the view that there's actually a lot of things that they didn't address, a lot of unresolved issues in how we think about justice between humans and animals, and that philosophy can and should contribute to that. So that's what I'm going to try to suggest. So one way to think about those arguments from 40 years ago is that they were almost exclusively focused on the intrinsic moral status of animals. So the argument focused, basically, Singer and Regan said that animals are sentient, they're conscious, they have a subjective experience of the world, they have a capacity to suffer, and because of these intrinsic moral characteristics, their interests should count. And of course, they disagreed about how strongly they should count, and so one version of the argument is that because animals are sentient, they have rights in the strong sense. They have the right not to be harmed for other people's benefit. And so an example of this in the real world would be the Great Apes project that some of you may have heard, which says that the great apes should be accorded these very basic rights not to be harmed for the benefit of others. They should not be experimented on, even for scientific knowledge. They shouldn't be held in zoos. Obviously, they shouldn't be killed for food or for fur. So that's a strong animal rights view. And then others are not sure that we can defend these strong rights claims and still instead say that maybe there are some circumstances in which humans can legitimately harm animals, but only if it's for a really important or really essential human interest. And then, of course, people disagree about what is a truly important or essential interest. And so some people think it's impermissible to harm animals for the fur, just for clothing, but that it's okay to kill animals for food. Others argue, in fact, there's no essential interest in eating animals for food, and so we shouldn't do that, but there is an essential interest in using them for medical research, so that's permissible. Anyway, so you're familiar with all of these arguments. These are all arguments about what follows from the fact that animals have an intrinsic moral significance, and people disagree about how strong those claims are. Okay, so just to put my cards on the table, I'm a defender of the strong animal rights view. I think we have no right to harm animals for our benefit. But that's actually not what I'm going to talk about. That's the old debate. What I want to talk about is what are some of the issues that are left unresolved by this older debate about the intrinsic moral status of animals. So, because I think many of the obligations we have to animals don't flow from their intrinsic moral status alone, but from the nature of our relationship to those animals. And so just to step back a sec, think about the human case. If we think about justice in our relations with human beings, sometimes we're interested in the question of intrinsic moral status. And so we ask, what do we all owe to other human beings simply in virtue of the fact of their intrinsic moral status as human beings? And if you ask that question, you're going to get something like a theory of universal human rights. So the United Nations has a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's a good starting point for thinking about what each human being owes every other human being simply in virtue of the fact that they're human beings. They have an intrinsic moral status. But that's just one question we ask about justice, and most of the time that's not the question we're focused on, at least not in political philosophy. Instead, we ask, what do we owe particular groups of people in virtue of the particular relationships we have with them? That's what we spend most of our time arguing about in political life, including in particular relations of citizenship. So just to make this a bit more concrete, imagine that a plane lands at Schiphol Airport and 100 people get off the plane. Okay, they're all human beings. They all have an intrinsic moral status, and therefore there are certain things we cannot do to them. We cannot enslave them. We cannot inject them with a virus in order to test medicines or whatever. So these are basic, fundamental, universal human rights we owe to every human being as they get off the plane. But as they get to passport control, it's going to turn out that these human beings have a different legal and political status in the Netherlands. Some of them are Dutch citizens, and that means that they have the right to enter the country, the right to live here, the right to work here, the right to vote here, and more generally, they belong to the people in whose name the state governs. They're a member of the Dutch demos, the political community. But not everyone getting off the plane is a Dutch citizen. Some of them are tourists. Some of them, like me, when I got off the plane yesterday, I'm here to do a professional service, to give a lecture at a conference. Others might be international students who've come to get a degree for a couple of years at a Dutch university, and so on. So they're human beings, but they're not citizens. And that means they may not actually have the right to enter the country. They may get turned back at passport control if they don't have the right visa. Or even if they do have the visa, that may mean they can only stay for 3 months, and then they have to go home. Or they can stay, but they can't work. Or they can work, but they can't vote, right? So we have a number of different legal and political statuses. We're all human beings with universal human rights, but we have very different membership relations with the political community. So we distinguish in everyday life between the universal rights we owe to all humans in virtue of their intrinsic moral significance, and then citizenship rights, which are based on your membership in a particular bounded political community. Okay, so we're all familiar with this basic distinction. And of course, it gets quite complicated because there are other categories we could think about. You could think about long-term immigrants to a country. They're not yet citizens, but they're certainly more than tourists. And so they come to have a legal status that's closer to citizenship. And sometimes in the political theory literature, we call this denizenship. to indicate that they're long-term residents, they have residency rights, but they're not yet citizens in the full sense. Or you could think about indigenous peoples around the world. They're citizens of the country in one sense, but in another sense, they're citizens of their own political communities, and they have overlapping sovereignty and so on. Okay, but all of these complications just reaffirm the main point, which is that one's intrinsic moral status as a human being radically underdetermines your legal and political status. Everyone has the same intrinsic moral status as a human being, but we have very different legal and political rights based on the ways in which we are members of different communities, right? Okay, so my claim is the same is true about animals, that animals all have certain basic rights in virtue of their intrinsic moral status, but they also have membership rights based on the ways in which they are or are not members of our society or their society or overlapping societies, and that in fact, it might be useful to think of animals as falling into the same basic categories that humans fall into. That's to say, some animals should be seen as our co-citizens. They are members of our community and should be seen as citizens of our community. Other animals should be seen as members of their own sovereign wild animal communities, and we should respect their autonomy and sovereignty. And other animals will be in between, having a kind of denizenship, the residents of our community, but not members in the full sense. Okay, so that's the idea that I want to, that we develop in this book, Zoopolis, that Sue and I wrote. Okay, so I don't have time to lay out all of the details. I just want to give you a flavor of what it would look like to think about animals, not just from the perspective of their intrinsic moral status, but also from this perspective of in what ways they are members of our society and what rights follow from their membership status. And again, I mean, we have books, we have bookshelves exploring the obligations we have to animals because of their intrinsic moral status. But I think we need much more thinking about the moral obligations that flow from these membership relations. Okay, so basically, I want to discuss three different kinds of relations that animals can have with us. And basically, the first is domesticated animals, the second is wilderness animals, and the third are what we call liminal animals. So I just want to say a few words about each of these three types. So the first is domesticated animals. So by domesticated animals, I mean animals that were once wild a long time ago, but humans have taken them out of the wild, brought them into our society, and selectively bred them over generations, often over millennia, in order to fit into our society and to become dependent on us in order to serve us. Okay, so what does this fact of domestication, I think, has huge moral implications for our relationship to domesticated animals. And one way to think of it is that domestication made them members of our society. Of course, the people who initially domesticated animals viewed them as a caste group that existed solely to serve us, right? But you can think of that as analogous to the case of human slavery, that slaves were brought into the United States as a caste group to serve whites. But the very process of incorporating blacks or domesticated animals means that we have made them members of our society. We need to recognize their membership rights. And the tool we use, in the human case, to recognize membership is citizenship. That, in my view, that is the function of citizenship, is to acknowledge membership in society. And citizenship is the tool we used in the slavery case to convert old relationships of caste hierarchy into the acknowledgement of membership, of shared membership. So, in my view, we have a moral obligation to extend that logic to domesticated animals. We should recognize them as members, and we should use citizenship as a tool to shift away from this old model of caste relationships into a recognition of just relationships. And I would argue that domestication not only gives us a moral obligation to extend citizenship to domesticated animals, it makes it possible in the following sense. Citizenship is a relationship of cooperation. To view someone as a co-citizen presupposes that you can imagine yourself engaged in cooperative activities with them. And that in turn requires that you be able to trust each other, that you be able to have some form of communication with each other, that you'd be able to exist in physical proximity, right? Literally right next to each other. So we're not capable of having these kinds of trusting cooperative relations with all animals. With most wild animals, we can't. But we know that we can have these relationships with domesticated animals, because it's only those kinds of animals that can be domesticated in the first place. And moreover, the selective breeding of animals over the generations has enhanced those capacities for trust and cooperation and communication. So in my view, the fact of domestication makes this extension of citizenship both morally obligatory and feasible. So we talk at length about what would it mean to extend citizenship in practice to domesticated animals. So citizenship is usually and rightly seen as a mix of both rights and responsibilities, and we can think about it the same in relation to domesticated animals. So there's certainly going to be a package of rights that would accompany the extension of citizenship. These would include basic rights to protection from harm. So obviously, the harming of animals would be a crime. But protection against also harms from predators. I think we have having domesticated animals, we have an obligation to protect them from predators, which is an obligation we don't have towards all other animals. We also have an obligation, I think, to provide a scheme of public health insurance for domesticated animals. We have an obligation to train emergency services to rescue domesticated animals. One of the terrible things about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans is that humans were told to leave their pets behind because the emergency services were not trained or equipped to rescue companion animals. Now, in my view, if we view them as co-citizens, we certainly should train and equip emergency services to be able to rescue them. There would also be implications for public space, that public space should be designed in a way that reflects the interests of animals as well as humans. So, for example, off-leash dog parks, which are a big issue where I come from. And there would also be requirements about the political representation of domesticated animals. And of course, the Dutch Party is the best example we have of that yet. Okay, so there's a bunch of rights that would accompany citizenship, but I think it's also interesting to think about the responsibilities that might accompany the extension of citizenship. So again, citizenship is a cooperative relationship, and any cooperative relationship, by definition, requires socializing people into shared norms of behavior. That's just part of what cooperation is. And so there would be a responsibility to socialize domesticated animals to be able to survive and to flourish within these shared norms of behavior. So, for example, it would be appropriate to socialize dogs not to bite other people, right? And not to bark at all hours of the day. Now, at the moment, I mean, some people worry about whether it's legitimate to be policing the behavior of pets in this way, because we're suppressing their natural instincts, and we're basically just doing it for our convenience. So isn't that a form of domination? But my response is that if we view this as part of a package of citizenship that also includes these robust rights, that there's nothing inherently wrong with socializing domesticated animals into norms of civility. Basically, again, any cooperative scheme requires that people learn how to flourish without harming or unduly burdening other members of the cooperative scheme. And it's legitimate to socialize domesticated animals to comply with that expectation. We could also think, perhaps even more controversially, about the idea of contribution. I think part of a feature of citizenship is that all members of the community would be expected to contribute to the common good in line with their interests and their inclinations. So there's an expectation of contribution in line with people's interests and inclinations. And in my view, I think there are ways in which we might envisage domesticated animals contributing to society that do really reflect their interests and their inclinations. So obviously I think various forms of companionship between humans and dogs and cats are an example, but you could also imagine some forms of work, like I think sheepdogs. As I see it, when I see them running around, it looks to me like that the work they're doing is consistent with their interests and inclinations. It seems to me it's something they enjoy doing and isn't radically at odds with their own interests and inclinations. We could also imagine the shearing of sheep for wool and the using of some animal products like wool would be consistent with citizenship. Obviously, we can't kill and eat animals. Like you don't kill and eat your co-citizens, but you could use some animal products like wool without that being a form of exploitation. But of course, there's a real risk here, because if we say we expect contribution from domesticated animals, there's going to be very strong temptation not to respect their interests and inclinations, but to try to get them to contribute in ways that reflect our interests and inclinations. And so I think so just to give some examples, I think that the way in which horses are broken in order to make them engage in show jumping or whatever, this is not a form of contribution that in any way, shape, or form is a reflection of their interests or inclinations. We have to break them in order to get them to fit our interests and inclinations, and that's just reverting to an old caste relationship. Okay, so this is the picture of citizenship I have in mind, a mixture of rights and responsibilities. Let me turn to the case of wild animals. Of course, most animals in the world are not domesticated. They're wild. But in the book, we distinguish two different types of wild animals because they have different relationships with us. So let me start with what we call truly wild animals. That's to say animals in the wilderness, animals living on their own habitat, away from humans, and indeed who try as much as they can to stay away from humans and to preserve their independence on their own habitat. So human society poses a number of real harms on wilderness animals at the moment. Obviously, it encompasses, in some cases, the very direct harm of hunting them or of capturing them for zoos or for animal research. But we also impose a series of indirect harms. We simply take over their territory, build suburbs and roads and so on. Or we degrade their environment through pollution and climate change and so on. So how do we think about justice in relation to wild animals, truly wild animals in the wilderness? So our suggestion is, I don't think this is a question we can answer just by focusing on their intrinsic moral status. I think we need to think about what would be a just relationship between wild animal communities and human communities. And our suggestion in the book is we should think of this as a relationship amongst sovereigns. We have our sovereignty over our territory, but we should recognize that they have sovereignty over themselves and their territory, and we need to respect that sovereignty. And so in the first instance, this would mean recognizing that their territory is theirs. It's not ours. We have no right to take it over, no right to colonize it or conquer it. So this would be, in the first instance, a very strong block against the continued expansion of the human race onto animal territory. But it also has an implication for the sharing of risks, that it's part of the nature of our relationship amongst sovereign communities that we sometimes impose spillover costs, and this is often unavoidable. You build an industrial plant near a border, there is going to be pollution across the border. And we have norms in international justice for thinking about how we reduce, how we remedy, how we compensate for unfairness in these indirect costs. But it also, I think, provides possibly some guidance for thinking about the issue of positive intervention. So most of our interventions in the wilderness are harmful, but we have the capacity sometimes to intervene in ways that reduce suffering for wild animals. But of course, we don't want to intervene too much, because that would be interfering with their autonomy. And so I think that one way to think about how we distinguish legitimate forms of intervention from illegitimate is precisely to think about animals as having a form of autonomy, the competence to govern themselves on their own territory. And what we would be trying to do, we shouldn't engage in any form of intervention that would permanently suppress their autonomous self-governance, that would put them permanently under human management. We don't want to turn nature into a zoo under the governance of humans. But we can, perhaps, if we're smart enough, make more limited forms of intervention that deal with certain kinds of threats that wild animal communities may not be able to address on their own. So this is a slightly science fiction example, but imagine that there's a kind of rogue bacteria that's about to decimate many different species, about to decimate an ecosystem. This is just going to swamp the capacities of wild animals to be able to maintain their own societies and communities. And if we had the power to stop that rogue bacteria, I think it would be permissible to do so. I think, in fact, we'd have an obligation to do that. But in part because the outcome of that intervention would be to restore their autonomy from a threat that they face and not placing them under permanent tutelage of the human race. Okay, so that's the wild animals, animals in the wilderness. And let me turn to the third category, which are liminal, what we call liminal animals, which means in between, and that's precisely what they are. They're part way between domesticated animals and wilderness animals. So by liminal animals, I mean, you know, the geese or the squirrels, the raccoons. I'm not sure what are the most common liminal animals here in the Netherlands, but so these are animals that live in areas of human settlement. They often seek us out because of the food supply that they find in cities, or because they have greater protection from predators. So these wild animals that live amongst us, urban wildlife, if you like, are a very interesting case and almost entirely neglected in the philosophical literature on animal rights, which is very interesting. These are the category of animals that most of us have the most interaction with in many cases, but almost entirely invisible in the animal rights literature. So what does justice require in relation to liminal animals? So in our view, it does not require viewing them as citizens. They're residents of our society, but we can't extend this citizenship model to them because, as I said, citizenship is a combination of rights and responsibilities, and to think of liminal animals as fulfilling the responsibilities of citizenship would require us to trap them, to capture them, and then to regulate their behavior so that, for example, they don't make noise. It's legitimate, I think, to train dogs not to bark all the time. We have no right to capture birds in order to get them not to make as much noise. So the fact is that these liminal animals have a way of life that is incompatible with the form of cooperation that we have with domesticated animals. And so I don't think it's appropriate to view them as co-citizens. But they are residents. We need to accept that they have a right to be here. And this is one of the fundamental problems, is that people still have this image that cities belong to humans, and that the only animals that belong here are those under our direct control, like companion animals. And so that these other urban wildlife don't really belong. They're pests, or they're foreign invaders, and that we have the right, therefore, to get rid of them, to exterminate them. And so you get these mass campaigns of killing pigeons or geese or whatever. So in my view, we need to accept this is their home. But unlike with wild animals, we can't give them sovereignty over their own territory because they're living right amongst us. They're living in the areas of human sovereignty, if you like. And so we need a new way of thinking about our relationship with them, which we call denizenship. So denizenship is meant to emphasize their secure rights of residency. We need to accept that this is where they live. This is where they belong. But it's not as intimate and cooperative a relationship as citizenship. It's a looser form, if you like, of tolerant coexistence. And so this means they would have both lesser rights and lesser responsibilities than domesticated animals. So, for example, unlike domesticated animals, I don't think we have a duty to protect urban wildlife from predators. I don't think we have a duty to protect the sparrow from being eaten by the hawk. Okay, so we have duties to protect our domesticated animals from predators that we don't have towards liminal animals. But on the other hand, as I say, they have lesser rights than domesticated animals, but they also have lesser responsibilities. So, and that means we have, as I said, no right to capture them and try to train them and socialize them to be more convenient to us or to fit into our schemes of cooperation. This model of denizenship operates on the premise that their way of life is incompatible with our conception of cooperation, of trusting cooperation with other humans and with domesticated animals. And so, as I say, it's a much weaker form of tolerant coexistence. And it would include duties of accommodation. So when we build our buildings, power lines, roads, and so on, we would take into account the ways in which those all impose risks on liminal animals. Okay, so I hope that just gives you a flavor of what a membership-based approach to animal rights would look like. So just to repeat, in my view, all animals, whatever category they fall into, have certain basic fundamental rights flowing from their intrinsic moral status. But we also have these relational duties, depending on the kind of relationships animals have to us. And I think that's been under-theorized in the animal rights literature. And I further believe that in trying to think through the nature of these relationships, we can learn something by thinking about the human analogs, ideas of citizenship, denizenship, sovereignty, territory, property, and so on. So I'm hoping that this way of thinking can inject a bit of life into what I view as a kind of stagnant debate on the philosophy of animal rights and help to overcome this kind of intellectual paralysis that I see since that great, there was a great kind of revolutionary moment of philosophy 40 years ago, and we've kind of lost that spark of enthusiasm, which I'd like to recover. I also would hope, I would like to think, that this way of thinking about animal rights can also be useful not just philosophically, but in practice, that this could be a model that people involved in, that practitioners of animal rights find this ideas inspiring and helpful. But I'm curious to hear your responses to that. Thank you very much.